Dr. Maclennan, and I want to introduce you to the series of webinars I'll be undertaking along with CHEC and CMHC over the next few months, really. These webinars discuss a recently completed series of papers that I researched and wrote along with my colleague Jin-Chao Long, and they were supported by CMHC, but they represent our views. The papers really argue for a radical shift in the ways in which housing policies are defined, designed, and delivered. And they advocate really a systems approach to understanding housing processes, and critically, the governance of housing. Because whilst often we make references to systems and talking about housing, it's much really presented as a kind of loose metaphor rather than a systematic systems approach to thinking about housing and how we might govern it. And as we build through the seminars, we make the point that we think we will not address the current set of housing difficulties we have unless we begin to shift to that particular point of view. The webinars look at three topics: housing in the economic system, housing and its impact on the net zero greenhouse gas system, if you like. And it looks, thirdly, using these first two papers as backgrounds and examples, ways in which we have to think about modernising the system of housing governance in Canada. We're not in the webinars, nor indeed in the papers that will be uploaded emphasising social concerns, but I want to emphasise right at the outset that social concerns, housing as a merit good, are obviously core to how we think about housing and housing policy. But I think they're relatively well understood, and they are very much at the centre of the housing debate in Canada and other countries, and indeed very much often dominate that. And I think that the economic and environmental outcomes that come out of the housing system need to be placed alongside the social issues, not in a sense demolishing the social arguments, but building new foundations to sit alongside them. Well, you might ask, why would we stress a systems approach? Well, about 80% of my career has been spent as a housing economist, working in universities and academia, and I still work at the University of Glasgow, University of New South Wales in Australia, and have an association and appointment with CHEC at McMaster. So these three countries form a particular Anglo-centric background to the remarks I might make. So that thinking about housing in a theoretical sense and modelling it and modelling systems is core to what I've done. I have also worked in government in Scotland as a special advisor to the first three First Ministers. I then worked as a chief economist in the state government in Victoria, in Australia, and then I worked as the chief economist in the Federal Department of Infrastructure and Cities in the federal government in Ottawa. I spent about 10 years doing that and had a sense, got some sense by experience of understanding how siloed multi-order government structures actually operated and how they deal with systems that are driven by influences from a whole range of silos and then impact the outcomes across a whole range of silos. And when we get to the number of these discussions, we'll see that failure to do that is, I think, at heart of some of the housing difficulties we have. In other words, both in my academic and policy experience, I know that everything in life is joined to everything else. Everything we can think about is in some sense a system. But we have to abstract from that, or as we academics would say, be a bit reductionist and generalize in different ways. And I think that there are important reductionist approaches to thinking about housing policy in academia that very much focuses on the social dimensions and processes in housing. And I think equally, there are different reductionisms in the way that governments operate and the extent to which they try to look across silos or manage joint enterprises or set missions that deal with multi-sector difficult missions. So in understanding these approaches, we have to think about what systems are. We have to, we're used to this in our lives in general. We think about our bodies as systems, our heating in our homes as systems, the way we travel, the weather, and indeed whether we gaze at the planets and the stars at night. So systems we think about a lot, and it's natural. But I think that moving beyond that to deliver the best policy understanding in relation to how we improve housing, and housing policy and housing thinking, I think, is at a real crossroads just now. We have to develop a workable system model. It's not too abstract. It doesn't throw out important connections or issues. And I think that's one of the great failures in government economic policy for housing, is it throws out by assumption too many of the important housing related issues. But we don't want the model to be too complex either, so we end up with paralysis by analysis. Well, we start from the position in what we're doing that governments and policies have this balance between reductionism, thinking across silos, thinking across sectors, thinking across different kinds of outcomes, and thinking about the way the system operates. We think we have the balance of understanding and policy is wrong, that we misunderstand how the housing system operates. The home ownership system in Canada does not operate the way that politics understands it as. We'll come back to that in the seminars. But we then actually end up mismanaging some of the significant dimensions of housing because we don't think about the cross-sectoral outcomes of housing and what they do. We make this observation, just moving along quickly. Really, a number of years ago, 5 years ago, we produced the Shaping Housing Futures report, which CMHC was involved in. And really, in that report, we were saying that housing problems have changed. It's no longer simply an issue about failing to produce enough housing or improve housing or make housing affordable for the traditional relatively low income merit good cases for housing. But in fact, although progress had been made in these areas of housing policy over long periods after the Second World War, that really since the 1990s, across a range of countries, there had been systematic and steady increases in homelessness, COVID period accepted, that the burden of rental payments had increased systematically for people in the bottom 20–30% of the income distribution. And equally at the same time, within the home ownership sector, there were growing difficulties for people 25 to 40 entering the system and people of all ages remaining within home ownership once they were in. It's a different complex set of issues compared with the way that housing policy had been largely constructed and aimed through much of the post-war period. In other words, I think what we are saying is that housing had always been a complex problem. It also had some quite well-defined solutions, but governments, and this isn't just about Canada, over the last 30 years, have adopted policy settings in housing and the systems around about it that have really allowed housing to become a wicked problem, a system problem, rather than a resource or rights problem, simply for a low-income group. And unless we get that this is a critical system problem, we're not going to address the right issues to begin to change. Well, when we look at the big changes that took place, It is. There were in many countries, and certainly in some periods in Canada in the last 30 years, when in fact there was a significant reduction in the resources available for traditional routes to policy solutions. In other words, building 3,500 non-market units a year rather than 35,000 compared with maybe 30 years before represents a significant and negative shift in terms of housing outcomes, particularly social outcomes. But we also, in a sense, saw a major shift towards market-led provision, and Canada's always been market-led and it will be market-led, and that's not a criticism. But what we're seeing is, in that context, shifting to markets to drive the outcomes for housing and for a broader range of housing. We didn't think about how markets work. We didn't, in a sense, have any coherent strategy for national and indeed local housing markets. In other words, we didn't take the system, i.e. the market system, that was the heart of shaping housing outcomes, and think about how, not only how it operated, but also what major policy influences drove it. In other words, the housing system outcomes we see are much more driven not by policies under the rubric of the housing ministry or the housing budget, but they're about immigration policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, environmental policy, and a whole range of other things. So we had no coherent strategy for bringing these drivers together. And very often, governments have gotten by until very recently by saying at a federal level, and this was true, say, in Australia, possibly even in the UK, less so, that, well, housing's a well-functioning market system. It's not our responsibility. Well, lots of evidence that suggests that the housing market isn't a well-functioning market system. And I challenge anyone to tell me when they last saw the Vancouver or Toronto metropolitan housing markets in a state of equilibrium, so that we have this view of the system as well functioning, whereas in fact it's not. We have to think about how we deal with that, because actually shaping a better market system is an important part of the solution. And we have to think about we unwind that, and also the assertion really that housing in Canada is a social problem, and therefore it's a provincial problem. I want to stress in this work that we see housing outcomes as problematic in the economy, problematic in the environment, and not just in the society, and that they are also multi-level and multi-order, both in their causes and their impacts, so that saying that it's a particular silo and a particular order of government that has core responsibility is maybe for the last century, is not for this millennium. So when we look at the system, just very quickly, a system has a series of structures and nodes, it has connections and flows, it's feedback. So a system is complex, it's connected, and it's changing. And that's how we have to think about housing. How complex is it? How connected is it? How is it changing? And we have to understand it and describe it. In that context, we have to rethink our definition of housing. As an economist, I would say housing is a fixed capital good. It's put in place, it's spatially fixed. Once you build it, unless we're in the world of mobile homes or tents, once you build it, it's fixed in place, it's fixed in the neighborhood, it's fixed in a point within a metropolitan area, and that it's an expensive capital good in relation to people's incomes, and therefore it constitutes an asset either for homeowners or landlords. It's involved with issues about loans, so that it's a major shaper of household activity and consumption. It's a major shaper of the asset position of Canadians, and it's a major shaper of debt positions of households. In terms of other ways of describing it, we talk about housing as a verb, if you like. There's the activities. We design it, we build it, we plan it, we maintain it, we sell it. These are big sectors within an economy. In fact, in a fast-growing metropolitan economy, housing activities of that kind can often take up to about 15, even 20% of employment within in a metropolitan area. So housing activities are big, and very often when non-economists talk about the economic effects of housing, they talk about these income, employment, and multiplier effects of the housing system. However, what we miss out, what we rarely do is say, these are structures that are created, and these structures have characteristics or attributes. They are more or less accessible to work, to schools, to places of play. They are set in a more stable neighbourhood or a less attractive neighbourhood. The homes themselves have adequate space, not adequate space. They may be connected to the internet. They may not be connected to the internet. In other words, the home and where it's located and home and neighbourhood are always purchased together, really is at the heart of the daily living systems of households. I don't think that sense gets conveyed in much policy thinking for housing. So how we live as a society, how we learn and have a daily economy is driven by our housing arrangements and how we impact the environment too. So we have to think, what are the big systems that drive housing diversity and outcomes? How does these housing systems actually function, as opposed to assuming they're well-functioning systems? What are the outcomes from these activities? Why don't we start housing policy discussions by saying, these are the outcomes that housing affects? We don't do that as a general rule. And then we need to ask the question about how does government govern round about these different things. That's the approach we are taking. What are the multiple activities, multiple silos that in a sense drive housing outcomes? The housing outcomes that arise, how do they in turn feed back on multiple sector levels and effects? And once we do that, there's no simple governance structure for housing. There's no simple saying the housing problem is a merit good problem. We need just more resources to deal with that, and we're going to resolve the issue. No, we're not. We have to manage the system, and we have to think about it in new ways. So, and 4 big takeaways from this discussion would be: the housing system is integrated across different tenures, across different value ranges in a whole different ways, and there are complex drivers of that system. There are complex policy drivers that are nothing to do with housing budgets as well. Secondly, there are multiple outcomes. Many of these outcomes might be small, they might be in the future, they might be somewhere else, so that the outcomes of good housing are not simply measured by traditional measures of housing need that we've dealt with really since the 1950s and 60s. Thirdly, spatial systems. Housing is always a spatial system. It's always local because it's in the ground, in a street, in somebody's neighborhood, but at the same time, its effects are more than local. The carbon that gets produced from domestic heating affects globally. The connections that people make from their homes can reach well beyond not only their neighborhood and metropolitan area, but the wider world, and we'll talk about that in the economic system. And then fourthly, the issues that we see, they're not just about supply or demand. People say now that housing is a supply issue. It's a shortage issue. We have to be concerned about housing shortages because they affect market outcomes and drive up prices. And of course, the shortages of housing that's affordable for people that need it are a subset of these general shortages. But our shortage issues will always contain a supply side and a demand side issue. So we then have whole sets of issues to consider about how we govern this complex system better for the future. We'll look at the economy in the first webinar. We'll look at the environment and the zero carbon question and housing in the second. And in the third, we'll draw out some of the preliminary observations about how we might govern Canadian housing differently. Thank you.